Okay, let's dive right into this. Early one Saturday morning in January 2026, the world woke up to some absolutely stunning news coming out of South America. U.S. forces had just launched a surprise raid in Venezuela.
And that was President Trump, speaking from Air Force One. With that one simple line, "We're going to run it, fix it," he basically kicked off a really dramatic and, let's be honest, incredibly controversial new chapter in U.S. foreign policy.
So here's what happened. In the dead of night, U.S. forces went into Caracas and captured the sitting Venezuelan president, Nicolás Maduro. This was a really audacious move, especially coming from a president who, had often campaigned against getting involved in stuff like this.
And get this, just 2 days later, there they are, Maduro and his wife, standing in a Manhattan federal court, pleading not guilty to drug trafficking charges. I mean, taking a sitting head of state and putting him on trial in the U.S. is completely unprecedented. So the big question is, how did we even get here? Let's unpack the whole thing.
The operation itself, codenamed Southern Spear, was lightning fast. But that speed, well, it came at a pretty significant human cost.
The Venezuelan government reported that over 70 people were killed, but here's where it gets really interesting. When you look at who died, among them were 32 Cuban nationals. And that's not just a claim. It was confirmed by both the Cuban and the Venezuelan governments, which definitely hints at some deeper international ties here.
You know, this didn't just happen in a vacuum. This raid was really the boiling point after months and months of escalating pressure in the waters right between the U.S. and Venezuela. As you can see on this timeline, things just kept ratcheting up over a few weeks. It starts with seizing an oil tanker, then it becomes a formal blockade, and then boom, a full-blown military operation. So, what was the official justification for a move this drastic?
So to justify something this big, the White House laid out a very, very specific case, not just for the American people, but for the whole world to hear.
And this is really where the whole story splits in two. On one hand, you have the administration's official line. This was a law enforcement mission, plain and simple, all about stopping narco-terrorism. But on the other hand, critics immediately started saying, no, this is about regime change, it's about oil, and it's about a very hawkish foreign policy.
And that skepticism was everywhere. You had commentators like Sagar and Jetty who immediately drew a line straight back to the Iraq War, basically saying that the whole drug rationale was just a flimsy excuse for a much bigger goal.
And the talk about oil wasn't exactly subtle. You had the president himself saying it, and even U.S. allies abroad were talking about it. Plus, critics were quick to point out that huge corporate interests, like ExxonMobil, who were already exploring in nearby waters, had a lot to gain from a change in leadership in Venezuela.
So, as you can probably imagine, the reaction from the rest of the world was, well, it was immediate and it was intense. The world was basically split right down the middle. America's biggest rivals, well, they did not mince words. China called it hegemonic behavior and said it was a serious violation of international law that threatened the whole region.
Russia was just as forceful. They framed it as a clear violation of national sovereignty and called it a straight-up act of armed aggression.
And Cuba, which has been a longtime ally of Venezuela, used the strongest possible language they could, calling it state terrorism against the brave Venezuelan people.
But it wasn't just the rivals who were speaking up. Even countries that are usually friendly with the U.S. were clearly nervous. Venezuela's neighbor Colombia expressed deep concern about a potential refugee crisis, and Spain was just calling for everyone to calm down. Okay, so let's bring it back home. Because inside the United States, this whole thing just ignited a political and legal firestorm that completely took over the weekend news. And it really all boiled down to one huge question that everybody was asking on the Sunday morning shows. Was this a police action, or had the president just launched a war? Now, the administration's answer was pretty clear. They came out in full force insisting, this is not a war, this is law enforcement. Their argument was they were simply carrying out an old indictment to cut off cartel profits.
But on the other side, you had a whole chorus of critics, Democrats and even some Republicans, arguing that the president had massively overstepped his authority and launched an illegal war without getting the approval from Congress that the Constitution requires.
And a huge part of the controversy was how this all went down in secret. The fact that the top leaders in Congress, the so-called Gang of Eight, weren't even briefed beforehand, well, that just fueled fears that the president had deliberately gone around Congress's power to declare war. So where does this leave us? With Maduro in a U.S. prison and his government pretty much in chaos, what on earth happens next? Honestly, the future for Venezuela is incredibly unpredictable right now. Now, on one hand, Venezuela's new interim government has said they're willing to collaborate with the U.S., which could be a huge shift. But, and this is a big but, the situation on the ground is an absolute tinderbox. Analysts are warning about everything from infighting and power vacuums to even bigger waves of refugees.
And that's really the question that hangs over this entire event. In the end, how will this be judged? Was this a massive, decisive victory for American interests? Or did this incredibly bold move, this sort of modern-day Monroe Doctrine, just plant the seeds for the next conflict in the region?